I am Marceline Hart, 29 years old, from North Carolina." He laughed so loudly the porcelain cup chimed against the saucer, and the barista glanced over. My ex-classmate Nolan tipped his chin at me and said, "Start your own business? You?" Loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. Steam drifted from the espresso machine like stage fog, while the lunch crowd paused between bites. Nolan leaned back in the wooden chair, smirking, sunlight flashing off the kind of watch he used to dream about in homeroom. "You'll be the CEO of wishful thinking," he added, savoring each syllable like it was expensive. Have you ever experienced this kind of betrayal? Share your story in the comments, and subscribe if you believe no one should be treated this way. I kept my palms flat on the table so he wouldn't see the shake in them, and said as evenly as I could, "I'm launching a facilities company. Small to start. Offices downtown," he snorted. "So, mops and buckets? Real empire talk." The bell over the door jingled as a couple slipped out fast, the way people exit when embarrassment becomes a draft. I tasted metal in my mouth, the way nerves taste, and swallowed it. "Small to start," I repeated. "Strong to last." He smiled wider, showy, mean. "Marcy, you barely survived economics. You don't have the numbers for this." Maybe his laugh hurt because it wasn't new. "In 10th grade, we worked the same sandwich counter." He pocketed the tip jar and told the manager I'd skimmed gift cards. I kept the job, but the rumor clung like fryer grease, stubborn, sour. After school, I took whatever paid the rent. Cashier, copy room, nights cleaning bank lobbies with lemon-scented gloves while a vacuum hummed like low tide. I learned the bones of buildings, the way fingerprints bloom on glass, how dust nests in corners, how floors talk under your feet when they're tired. "Why tell me?" he said now, tearing a sugar packet with theatrical care. "Looking for investors? I've got lunch money." He flicked a quarter. It wobbled and landed by my wrist. His friends at the counter snorted on cue. I set the coin on a napkin, steady. "I'm telling you because I'm done letting other people write my future," I said. "And because one day you'll remember this conversation and wish you'd been kind." He raised his cup in a mock toast. "To delusion." In my bag waited a notebook. Pricing models, OSHA notes, square foot rates penciled and repenciled, and the name I'd chosen, Hart Facility Services. On my keyring were 2 fresh keys, each earned with a careful proposal and a firm handshake. "You don't get to shrink me," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. Nolan's smile thinned. "Then show me, Marcy. Succeed." The chair's legs rasped against tile like a match striking when I stood. I left the quarter gleaming on the napkin like a period only I could finish. Outside, the air smelled like it had just rained, even though the sky was blue and hard with heat. A text pinged from Ms. Patel, confirming the evening walkthrough at her real estate office. 20 cubicles, 2 conference rooms, nightly glass, weekly buffing. Small but real. I pulled my shoulders back and walked toward the skyline where the towers blinked like dares. Back home, my apartment smelled like citrus and resolve. A taped-up map of downtown hung beside a clipboard schedule. I'd saved enough for a second-hand floor scrubber and 2 commercial vacuums. On the couch lay folded polos, navy with heart stitched over the pocket, the thread a neat heartbeat. "We start with trust," I told the empty room. "We grow with consistency. We finish with shine." I ran the pitch the way singers run scales until my voice belonged to me again. Mom arrived with a casserole and a hug that lasted longer than usual. We never had extra when I was a kid. She kept a mason jar on top of the fridge labeled "Someday," quarters and dimes clinking when we could spare them. Sometimes we spent someday on brake pads or the light bill. Sometimes someday bought pizza. But the jar kept an idea alive, forward, even if it's slow. When I told her I'd filed the paperwork, she pressed her palms to my cheeks and said, "Baby, build the life that pays you back." She didn't laugh. She didn't warn me I'd fall. She asked how she could help, and we made a list. That night, I cleaned Ms. Patel's space until the carpet lines looked like a combed field. I wiped the oily smudges from the glass doors and saw my face clearly for once. Not daydreaming, doing. By midnight, my back ached. The good ache you get when a beginning is heavy and you carry it anyway. On the way out, I slid a business card under the neighboring suite's door with a note. "New team in the building. Ask Ms. Patel about us. Best, Marceline. And listen to the hallway settle like a stage after the curtain falls. Days learned a rhythm. Mornings were sales, knocking on property managers' doors with brownies wrapped in cellophane and a folder of insurance certificates. Afternoons were supplies and bids, reading floors the way mechanics read engines, hearing the difference between a wine that wants oil and a wine that wants rest. Nights were work, hauling, scrubbing, shining, moving through checklists like choreography. I hired one person, then two, Joy, whose laugh made mop buckets feel lighter, and Luis, who could fix any machine with a screwdriver and a prayer. We met in my apartment, unfolded a card table, and mapped routes with highlighters. Sometimes, when the city finally went quiet and the mop water ran clear, Nolan's laugh rose in my memory. It didn't sting anymore. It sounded small, like a door closing on an empty room. In the fluorescent stillness of other people's success, I understood something tender and fierce. I wasn't chasing an apology. I was building a future where his opinion couldn't afford rent. The cafe was only a room with chairs. My life was the building with keys. A week after the cafe, invoices in my folder, I walked that same block and saw him through the window, bragging to someone new. For one heartbeat, my steps faltered. Then I fixed the strap of my sample case and kept moving. A different bell jingled as I entered a dentist's office. The receptionist glanced up, wary, then curious when she saw the folder. "Hi," I said, breathing steady. "I'm with Heart Facility Services. I think we can make your mornings easier." Behind me, traffic sighed. Somewhere in a memory, a coin rolled on tile and fell, far from the floor I stood on. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't hide. Betrayal had done its cruel work, but it had done something else. The way a blade prunes a branch and somehow more green bursts from the cut. I set my card on the counter. The ink still smelled like a promise. The receptionist smiled. "We've actually been looking," she said. "The last company kept missing corners." I nodded, thinking of every corner I'd ever noticed and every corner I'd refused to miss. That afternoon, Ms. Patel texted a thank you selfie beside the gleaming conference table, thumbs up and a caption, "Our floors never looked better." I forwarded it to Mom with a heart and no other words, because some wins are quiet on purpose. Evening rolled in warm and gold. Joy found the rhythm of the buffer, and Luis tuned the scrubber until it purred. I wrote our mantra on the whiteboard over the schedule. Show up, shine, stay humble. Then I packed sample kits for the next day and laid the polos on the chair like tomorrow waiting. When I finally slept, I dreamed of clean glass and open doors, of keys that turned smoothly, of rooms that welcomed me instead of daring me to prove I belonged. Morning laid a stripe of light across the folded shirts like a benediction. I thought of Nolan's laugh and felt only distance. He had given me a scene. I had given myself a story. I braided my hair with quick, practiced hands, met my own eyes in the mirror, and blessed the day ahead with the line I'd say to the next receptionist, the next property manager, the next doubter who mistook me for small. Let me show you what clean really looks like. Bills arrive like uninvited guests, rattling every cup in the cabinet. After the cafe, I opened a mailbox crammed with envelopes, utilities, insurance, a rent reminder printed in anxious red. I stacked them on the table and stared, as if the ink might blink and look away first. It didn't. It never does. That night my mother called. She always phoned on Mondays, the way some people light a candle they don't believe in. "How are you, baby?" she asked, and before I could answer, the edge slid through. "You sound tired. Are you finally thinking about a steady job?" I told her I had 2 new clients and 1 walkthrough scheduled. "You can't keep chasing what doesn't want you," she said. "Be realistic. Office work has health insurance. You could breathe." I traced the table's wood grain with my thumb and pictured breathing the way she meant it. The air you earn by sitting still. Her discouragement always arrived dressed as concern. During the lean months, when I ate noodles 3 nights in a row and the landlord's footsteps haunted the hallway, she polished phrases until they shone like truth. "Your cousin manages a bank branch. There's a city job with a pension. I saw a posting for reception. You'd be great at smiling." I learned to answer gently so the conversation wouldn't explode. "I'm building something, Mom." Honey, scaffolding is not a building. When I hung up, the apartment kept her voice for a while, tucked in the corners like dust. I vacuumed late, not because the floor was dirty, but because the hum filled the spaces where doubt tried to nest. Childhood didn't arm me against this kind of warfare. It taught me how to absorb it. She worked double shifts and counted tips by the glow of the fridge, so praise felt expensive and reality wore work boots. When I was little, I mistook her silence for approval. When I was older, I recognized it as fear. She didn't want me to break, because she had spent a life glued together. Adulthood turned fear into evidence. If I was late on rent, it proved her point. If I patched the tire again, it proved her point. If I cried, quietly, in the shower so the tile could swallow the sound, well, that proved it most of all. She loved me, and she loved her theory about me, maybe more. The theory was simple. Bright daughters should be safe, not brave. Whenever I chose brave, the theory sharpened its teeth. Small humiliations gathered like lint. A friend's birthday dinner where the card machine declined my first swipe and the waiter said, loudly, "Try again." A networking event where I answered truthfully, "I run a tiny facility service," and watched 3 suits rotate their bodies toward richer air. A Tuesday morning I won't forget, when the temp agency sent me to a law office for filing. The office manager winked at my clipboard and said, "You're competent. Have you considered staying in your lane?" I went home and scrubbed the tub until the enamel flashed. People think cleaning is erasure, a way to make evidence vanish. It isn't. It is the practice of noticing. A streak means the wipe was careless. A scuff means somebody turned too fast. A shine, real shine, means someone honored the surface and the hands that will touch it next. I decided to honor my own surfaces that way, even if the mirror reflected uncertainty back at me. On Thursdays, I volunteered to clean the church hall because they let me practice with their floor machine. Pastor Reed said, "You move like you're polishing your name." I didn't know how to explain that I was. My mother called from the parking lot once, her voice chipping at the afternoon. I drove by the hiring center. They're adding clerks. You fill out one form, you're in. I told her I'd think about it, then guided the machine in slow, faithful passes, like prayer you can see. Joy joined me during those weeks, all freckles and easy jokes. She'd whistle and even the mop listened. "You're the first boss who cares where the baseboards breathe," she said. We ate sandwiches on milk crates between shifts, and I taught her how to fold towels so they stack like good habits. She taught me how to laugh without apology. When the lights buzzed and the building sighed and we were the only ones left, she'd toss me a look that asked, "This will be a story someday, won't it?" I'd nod because I needed it to be true. My mother kept the cadence. "How's the plan?" Always meant, "Are you done yet?" When I said I'd landed a medical billing office, she exhaled the word temporary, like a smoke alarm that wouldn't stop. When I said I'd ordered shirts with my name, she said, "Merchandise is for companies." I imagined peeling the vinyl letters up, sticking them back onto the transfer sheet, returning to blank. Instead, I pressed the embroidery with my palm until the thread felt like backbone. I bought a ledger and wrote every task like a vow. Vacuum haul, baseboards, sanitizing wipes, glass. I wrote, "Arrive 5 minutes early, leave 10 minutes better." I wrote, "We are not invisible." Sometimes writing is a rib cage for belief, and belief needs someplace to live. On Sundays, I'd visit her with pie, because love still looked like bringing something sweet and pretending time isn't sharper than knives. She'd cut a slice, press a fork into my palm, and begin again. Benefits, Marceline. People your age think grit is a plan. My plan is to own my time, I'd say. And what if time doesn't want you? It's hard to describe the fatigue of defending the invisible. Buildings offered proof I could point to. Shine, order, lemon air. But a future you're inventing while broke is a shy animal. Show it to the wrong person and it bolts. So some afternoons I canceled the call before it happened. I told her I was busy. I told myself I was kind. The day before the cafe, my checking balance blinked its thin number at me like a dare. Panic rose, hot and practical. The grocery list shorter, the fuel needle lower, the embarrassing prayer I kept in my pocket for when the card reader thought I was less than enough. That night she phoned and her voice was soft, almost kind. "You could be comfortable by now," she said. "Comfortable is not a sin." Neither, I wanted to say, is courage. But courage costs. I paid in quiet, in skipped dinners, in saying no to invitations that required outfits my budget couldn't respect. I paid in the insult of other people's certainty. Then came Nolan's laugh, clean and public and perfectly shaped to fit every doubt my mother ever mailed to my doorstep. It echoed because it found a room already built. He didn't need to pour the concrete. He only needed to clap. After, I did what I always do. I worked. I polished until my wrists ached. I wrote a proposal with sentences that stood up straight. I changed vacuum belts and my mind at the same time. I would not audition for my own life anymore. When the phone rang Monday, I let it. The machine swallowed her message whole. "Baby, are you there?" I found a listing. I swept, slow and steady, crumbs lifting like tiny white flags. The cage wasn't made of steel. It was made of sentences repeated until they hardened. I didn't rattle it. I found the hinge. I found the pin. I pocketed it like a coin I'd finally earned. The human heart doesn't break cleanly. It cracks like old plaster, hairlines first, then widening fissures until one soundless shift brings the wall down. For me, the shift didn't happen at the cafe when Nolan laughed. It happened later that same night, at my kitchen table with my mother's voice trapped inside the voicemail machine like a ghost rehearsing its lines. I replayed her message even though I knew every tone before it played. "Baby." I found a listing. Full benefits Monday to Friday, no nights. "Don't torture yourself. You can't build a future on hope." Her words wrapped me like cold cloth. I sat there with the screen still glowing, the ledger open beside a stack of envelopes fat with consequences, and something inside me finally, mercifully, broke in the right direction. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I didn't rehearse comebacks to a room full of ghosts. I simply pushed the voicemail button again, listened to her doubt on loop, and realized I didn't owe her another explanation. Or anyone. For years I had treated doubt like a judge, one I had to convince, persuade, out-argue. But that night I saw the truth. Doubt was a spectator, not a referee. It couldn't stop me unless I handed it the whistle myself. I stood up slowly, like someone learning they still have legs after a long sleep, and went to the closet. I pulled out everything that looked like concession. The generic office blazer I kept just in case. The unscuffed flats bought for interviews I canceled at the last second. I folded them not gently, but with finality, and dropped them into a bag bound for donation. The zipper sounded like closure. Then I took out the polos I'd had embroidered. Navy cotton, neat white heart stitched over the heart. I ran my thumb across the thread until it felt like spine. I laid one across the chair and looked at it the way people look at their name on a deed. This wasn't merchandise. This was declaration. I sharpened my pencils and rewrote the price sheet for the 5th time. This time the numbers didn't tremble. I drafted a cold email to 3 property managers with a subject line that didn't bow. Reliable after-hours service. New availability this week. I attached my insurance certificate, not apologies. My hand didn't shake. Midnight turned to 2 a.m., and the room stayed bright. Not because I was frantic, but because I was awake in a new way. The ceiling didn't press down. The walls didn't listen for collapse. Something inside had stepped to the front of the room and said quietly, "It's my turn now." In the morning, I woke with the steadiness of someone who has decided. I didn't check my phone for reassurance. I didn't replay the cafe scene or rehearse imaginary arguments with people who had already taken enough rent from my head. I put on the navy polo-like armor and packed the sample kit. The air outside was crisp, sharp with the smell of hot asphalt cooling under shade. I drove to the dentist office I'd visited before, the one where the receptionist sighed about missed corners, and walked in without an appointment. "We remember you," she said, surprised but not displeased. "You came prepared." I slid the folder across the counter. "Corners are the first truth of a cleaner," I said. "Let me fix yours." She called the office manager. I stood still with my shoulders square while they flipped pages. Approval didn't feel like lightning. It felt like a nod, a simple, "Let's try a 3-month contract." I shook her hand and held the moment in memory, not for bragging rights, but as proof that reality answers persistence louder than permission does. When I stepped outside, I didn't breathe triumph. I breathed relief, the quiet kind that feels like putting down something you didn't know you were carrying. I sat in the car and wrote the first invoice header with my company name typed at the top, black and firm. That night, I worked Ms. Patel's office like the floor was bearing witness. I buffed until the lights doubled in the shine. I wiped the fingerprints until the glass forgot they were ever touched. I swapped can liners like I was editing a draft. Joy sang off-key to the radio and said, "Boss, you look different," I said. I stopped negotiating with people who aren't paying the cost. She nodded like she understood, without needing the backstory. After we finished, I stayed alone for an extra hour, sitting on the conference table edge, looking out at rows of sleeping desks. The city was a low hum outside, lights blinking like constellations rearranging themselves. And I realized the snap wasn't rage. It was release, a bone setting back into its rightful place. Snapping is not the moment you break. It is the moment you stop bending. Mom called again 2 days later. I let it ring. There comes a point when explaining becomes a form of surrender, like translating your courage for someone committed to misunderstanding it. I chose silence, not out of spite, but out of conservation. Some energy belongs to the build, not the battle. A week passed, and momentum began to form. Not explosive, not cinematic, but accumulative the way water carves stone. Ms. Patel referred me to the accounting firm 2 floors down. The dental office approved a trial run. A property manager replied to my email with a request for a proposal. I said yes to all of it and rested between none of it, yet the world outside didn't soften. At the grocery store, I ran into a girl from school who asked what I was doing now, and when I answered, she tilted her head with pity, disguised as politeness. "Cleaning?" she said, as if the word were dust itself. I didn't shrink. I said, "Building a company," and left her blinked in place. That's when I knew the snap had changed more than my plans. It had changed my posture. I no longer spoke like someone hoping to be believed. I spoke like someone already underway. The night before my first payroll, I sat at the same kitchen table and tallied hours for Joy and Luis. I wrote their names in firm ink and felt something bloom in my chest. Not pride, not yet, but legitimacy. Money leaving my account because people had worked under my name was the cleanest evidence I'd ever held that this wasn't fantasy. Effort had matured into structure. I looked again at the voicemail icon glowing on my phone. I thought of Nolan's laugh, my mother's worry dressed as verdict, the years of microcuts disguised as advice. I pressed delete, not because the voice was gone, but because it didn't govern me anymore. The moment I snapped was the moment I stopped performing smallness for people who can't imagine anything else. That night, in the hush of a building I cleaned with my own hands, I touched the glass one more time and saw my reflection clear and unargued. For the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone to believe me. I had begun. Silence is loud when you are building something no one else believes in. It roars under doors, sits heavy on the couch cushion beside you, follows you from room to room like a witness waiting for you to fail. In the weeks after I hired Joy and Luis, isolation stopped being a condition and became an atmosphere, something I breathed, slept in, and woke up beneath. Days were motion. Nights were weight. I learned new forms of tired, the kind that sits behind the eyes and not the bones. After cleaning 2 buildings and bidding on a third, I would come home to a refrigerator that held only condiments and a drawer with 3 forks. I'd collapse on the edge of the bed without undressing, still smelling faintly of ammonia and metal. My body slept like it was falling down a shaft. Sunday never came. It was always Monday with different lighting. Joy and Luis had spouses, friends, weekend barbecues, and birthday dinners. They showed up bright and whole. I showed up quiet, with a phone that never rang unless a client needed something fixed or my mother wanted to repitch safety. Even the mailman knew my schedule. He left envelopes like insults. I stopped answering invitations, not because I was too busy, though I was, but because I had nothing to offer in conversations that required the performance of comfort. I had no vacation photos, no house down payment, no engagement story, no bragging rights except a ledger that still bled red ink. I lived between effort and proof. The worst hours were 3 to 5 a.m., when work was done but sleep refused. My mind replayed possibilities like film reels, late invoices, broken machines, losing a client because one trash can was missed. Failure didn't threaten loudly. It whispered in logic. I kept a notebook by the bed to trap the thoughts before they multiplied. Money was a leash, a belt on the lowest notch. I ate what cost least, and stretched electricity like an apology. Some mornings I counted coins without shame, just precision. When Joy joked, "Boss, you're getting skinny," she didn't know starvation was a project phase. The discouragement from my mother arrived faithfully. "You sound worn out. You're too young to live like this." One steady job would change everything. She never said, "I don't believe you are capable anymore." She said, "I don't believe it is rational to try. The difference is grammatical, not emotional." Sometimes I held the phone away from my ear and looked at myself in the black glass, hair pulled back, eyes ringed, jaw set like mortar, and wondered if she was right. Not because I wanted to quit, but because fatigue distorts scale. When you stand too close to fear, it looks like a mountain. Even Nolan found a way to echo. His laugh replayed at odd hours like a ringtone I never set. The quarter he flicked might as well have been nailed to the inside of my skull. His certainty irritated like grit under a contact lens. Tolerable, but never invisible. There were failures. One night, the buffer belt snapped in the middle of a bank lobby, and the supervisor walked through early. "Unprofessional," she muttered. Another client canceled after 2 weeks, saying we were too new to depend. I signed the termination email with a polite tone and then locked myself in the supply closet at the next job, and cried between can liners, but I kept the failures small on purpose. I dissected each one with the same method I cleaned glass. Pressure, consistency, repeat until the streak dissolves. I bought spare belts. I arrived 20 minutes earlier for each shift. I walked every corner twice. I built competence until repetition became muscle. There were no applauses for surviving the quiet. Success had no witnesses yet. The world applauds only after you no longer need it. One night I dropped Joy and Luis off and returned to clean the medical billing office alone. The carpet was soft and beige, the cubicles like muted puzzles. I worked in silence, halfway through wiping the glass between cubicles. I glanced at my reflection, the navy polo, the ponytail, the shoulders no longer hunched, and realized the woman looking back did not need rescuing. She needed time. Time is expensive when you are broke. But I paid in hours instead of excuses. Around week 8, Ms. Patel emailed, "We'd like to extend to a 6-month contract." The words landed like a weight lifted off my lungs. Joy hugged me at the supply cart like we had won the lottery. In a way we had, not money yet, but duration. Time to prove ourselves is its own currency. The next day, Luis texted that his brother's auto shop needed floors stripped and waxed. Then, the property manager from the accountant's office forwarded my proposal to her colleague across town. A single yes can drag 2 more yeses behind it like train cars. Still, isolation stayed. Growth didn't erase the quiet. It merely furnished it with purpose. One night I drove past the cafe where Nolan laughed. I did not go in. I watched through the glass as new people sat in our old seats, laughing at something that had nothing to do with me. The world had not kept a shrine to my humiliation. It had forgotten. I was the only one still carrying it, so I put it down, not as forgiveness, as weight reduction. I drove to a 24-hour store and bought groceries with the first clean profit of the month. Fruit, meat, things that required a pan instead of a microwave. I cooked at midnight with the window open and the radio low. The onions sizzled like applause meant for the living. I sat at the table and ate without rushing. I did not feel triumphant. I felt oxygenated. Progress is not euphoria. It is the moment you can breathe without defending your breath. When I finished eating, I washed the plate, wiped the counter, entered the invoice for the new job, and turned off the light. The apartment fell into dark, not as a threat, but as a room waiting for morning. Isolation was still there, but now it stood at the edges, no longer over my throat. What remained at the center was work, breath, and the thin, steady line of a future under construction. And for the first time since the beginning, I could feel, faint but firm, that I was not losing, I was becoming. Power does not announce its arrival. It doesn't kick down the door or flash a crown. It slips in quietly the day you realize you no longer flinch. For me, that day came not with a contract or a compliment, but with a refusal. The first time I said no, without guilt. A law office downtown called after seeing our work in the medical building. The manager spoke with the practiced arrogance of someone who expects the world to kneel. "We need nightly cleaning," she said, "but we can't pay your rate. Exposure should compensate." Exposure, the currency of people who think your hunger is their leverage. I didn't hesitate. "We don't trade professionalism for visibility," I said. The air between us tightened. "Then we'll find someone cheaper." "You usually do," I replied, and hung up before my voice could shake. When I set the phone down, nothing inside me collapsed. Instead, something stood up straighter. That no was worth more than their yes. It proved I was no longer bargaining with my own worth. Meanwhile, the small yeses multiplied. The accounting firm signed a quarterly contract. The dentist office added window cleaning. Ms. Patel asked if I'd consider a day porter shift twice a week. Revenue didn't surge, it stacked. Brick, brick, brick. With revenue came options. I upgraded our vacuums instead of holding them together with tape and prayer. I ordered a second set of uniforms. I designed a simple trifold brochure on my kitchen floor at 2 a.m., cutting mock-ups with the same concentration surgeons use. On the cover I wrote, "We clean like people work here tomorrow," but the real power came from precision. I audited our hours, mapped fuel costs, rewrote our scope sheets to remove anything vague. Ambiguity is where profit bleeds. I stopped apologizing in emails. I started using declarative sentences. "We will arrive at 7:09. We recommend quarterly buffing. Attached is the updated invoice." Periods became armor. The city began to treat me differently, or maybe I met it with a different spine. I walked into buildings like someone who had been invited, not tested. I shook hands without lowering my eyes. Even my silence grew stronger. I stopped explaining pauses as if I owed strangers a tour of my head. My mother, persistent as weather, continued her Monday calls. "Are you exhausted?" she asked once. "Yes," I said, letting the truth stand without an invitation to critique it. "You don't have to do this the hard way," she murmured. I folded laundry with one hand and said, "There is no easy way, only the way I can live with." She sighed the way disappointed people sigh, as if exhaling can rewrite facts. But it slid off me. You stop bleeding from a blade once you realize you can walk away from the wielder. Some evenings, when Joy and Luis had gone and the building lights hummed low, I lingered in the lobby and felt something new under my ribs. Authority. Not over people, over myself, over my direction, over the terms on which my life would be written. Then, by accident, I stumbled on leverage. A regional property manager toured one of our buildings unannounced while I was inspecting. He watched me wipe a fingerprint from the chrome of an elevator panel with the edge of my sleeve. "Most owners would have delegated that," he said. "Most owners never notice it," I answered. He smiled, not kindly but knowingly. "We're terminating a janitorial contract across 8 locations. They look clean until you look close. You look close." That night we met in his office. He outlined square footage and scope with the boredom of someone used to mediocrity. When he asked my rate, I didn't blink. He raised an eyebrow. "Ambitious." "No," I said. "Accurate." He leaned back, studying me. "You run a small outfit. This is scale." "Scale without standards is waste," I replied. He laughed once, not cruelly but impressed. "Send the proposal. If it's as tight as your mouth, we'll talk." I wrote that proposal like scripture. Every line exact. Every cost justified. Every deliverable measurable. I attached our insurance, references, equipment list, and a start schedule drafted as if approval was a formality. I didn't decorate the email with eagerness. I wrote, "See attached. Available to begin with 10 days' notice." 3 days passed with no answer. Doubt tried to crawl back in, but I fed it nothing. On the 4th day, his reply came. "Contract enclosed. You start next month. $10,000 a month before expenses." A number that once would have felt fictional. I didn't scream. I didn't dance. I sat in my car in the parking lot and let the shock settle like sediment. Then I called Joy and Luis and told them to clear their calendars. They screamed for me. That night, I printed the contract and set it on the kitchen table. I placed my hand flat on it, not to claim it, but to absorb it. The paper didn't feel like luck. It felt like a receipt, proof that relentless is a currency. The next Monday, my mother called right on schedule. "How are you?" she asked. "Busy," I said. "Growth. Growth?" she repeated, like tasting an unfamiliar spice. "Yes," I said. "More work than we can hold in 2 hands," she hesitated. "Well, if it works, maybe that's good." It was the closest she had ever come to blessing. I didn't try to widen it. Power is knowing you don't need someone to believe in you for the thing to be real. That week, I opened a business account separate from my personal one. I paid Joy and Luis early. I ordered ID badges and magnetic vehicle signs. I signed the lease for a tiny storage bay so chemicals no longer lived in my coat closet. I bought myself a hot dinner without guilt for the first time in months. Then, with clean profit from our first large payment, I walked into an office supply store and bought a heavy safe. "You expecting treasure?" the cashier joked. "No," I said, sliding my card. "I'm building it." At home, I bolted the safe to the floor and placed the signed contract inside as the first artifact. I locked it and spun the dial with reverence, not for what was in there, but for who I had become between 0 and this. Power is not dominance. It is self-authorship. It is the day you stop asking and begin declaring. The day the world doesn't shrink you unless you consent. The day you realize the only door you needed opened was the one you keep inside your ribs. And on that day, I understood. I was no longer proving that I could start. I was proving that I would finish. Revenge rarely begins with rage. It begins with record keeping, with noticing who doubted you, who dismissed you, who bet on your collapse, and then continuing to build while they keep watching with smirks that don't age well. Chapter 6 didn't feel like vengeance when I lived it. It felt like preparation disguised as routine. Once the 8-location contract was secured, my calendar became a war map. I broke down staffing, rotation, supply runs, and quality checks until there wasn't a hinge in the schedule loose enough for failure to slip through. While the city slept, I walked square footage with a clipboard like a surveyor marking land. Except what I was claiming wasn't carpet or glass, but legitimacy. And with legitimacy came visibility. People who once ignored me began to circle back. A girl from school messaged, "Proud of you, Queen. I knew you'd do big things." The same girl once told me cleaning was not a career but a filler until life starts. I didn't reply. I archived the message like evidence. People respect the finished house, never the scaffolding. Others were less covert. One afternoon, I ran into Nolan again, the ex-classmate who laughed in the cafe loud enough for strangers to witness. He stood outside a lunch spot downtown, holding a to-go bag and a cheap suit jacket that wrinkled at the elbows. When he recognized me, his mouth twitched. Not smile, not apology, just discomfort. "Well," he said, eyes scanning the logo on my polo. "Looks like you're still doing the cleaning thing." I looked at him with the polite detachment you reserve for a stranger. "Yes," I said. "We just picked up 8 more buildings. How's your career?" The question landed like a stone dropped in shallow water. He cleared his throat. "Job hunting at the moment," he muttered. "Company downsized," I nodded once. "It happens," I said, the same wording people once used on me as if failure were my native language. He shifted. "You ever think of doing something bigger?" I smiled. Not wide, not cruel, just enough to show I heard the irony. "This is bigger. You just couldn't see it." His eyes flickered the way bullies do when the floor tilts. I left him standing there, and the door of the restaurant closed behind me like punctuation. Meanwhile, my mother sharpened her concern into sharper advice. 8 buildings? That's too much for you. You'll get sued. You'll collapse. You should pull back before you ruin everything. Her voice wrapped caution around condescension like twine. I used to absorb those words like acid on cotton. Now they beaded and rolled off. "Mom," I said finally, calm as glass, "please stop calling me with fear. If you can't support, stay silent." She gasped like I had slapped her. But boundaries are not blows. They are locks installed after too many break-ins. The setup phase of revenge is ugly because you don't get applause while you're sharpening your edge. You just get fatigue and repetition and the slow tightening of screws. For weeks, I rose before the sun and finished after the moon dissolved. I trained new hires, walked floors, wrote handbooks. built systems so tight even sabotage would bounce off. And yet, cruelty still found its ways. At one building, a senior employee sneered when he saw our crew. "Outsourced janitors," he muttered loud enough. "Cut rate labor." I straightened the sign-in clipboard and looked him in the eye. "Cut rate implies cheap." "We are not cheap. We are accurate," he scoffed. "Same thing." "No," I said. "You'll know the difference when you stop sticking to your own floor." His face flushed under fluorescent lights. Power is sometimes just refusing to duck. Another night, a woman in heels passed me in the lobby and said into her phone, "People with real careers aren't scrubbing tiles at midnight." I did not correct her. I didn't need to. In 3 weeks, her company would renew our contract at double scope. Some people are stage props in the story of your rise, useful only as contrast. While I built in silence, I also documented, not out of spite, but out of preparation. I kept a folder titled Archive, screenshots of messages from doubters, voicemails from my mother telling me to quit, the note I wrote the night of the cafe humiliation. Not to reopen wounds, to remember the calibration. Pain is a compass when read correctly. And while I built, the city shifted in small, delicious ways. I heard my company's name spoken in elevator conversations by people who didn't know I was within earshot. I saw our logo on badges and door tags in buildings where I once entered only through the back service hall. I watched new hires treat my policies like standards instead of guesses. The setup wasn't just logistics. It was transformation disguised as grunt work. It was the week I filled out employer, tax forms, and realized the government now recognized me as the origin of someone else's paycheck. It was the afternoon I rejected a client who wanted on-call cleaning at half rate, and they blinked when I said, "We are not the cheap option." It was the quiet. Evening, I sat in my car outside a skyscraper I used to walk past with my head down, and realized my badge opened the service entrance with a beep of belonging. Nobody clapped for those moments, but something inside me did. Revenge is not the scene where the villain falls. Revenge is the months of becoming unrecognizable to the people who once measured you with a ruler meant for cages. By the end of the setup phase, I no longer fantasized about proving anyone wrong. I was too busy becoming right. I continued polishing floors not because I was small, but because I was loading the spring. The strike was coming. And when it did, it would not be loud. It would be undeniable. The strike didn't arrive with trumpets. It began the way rot does, quietly revealed when someone finally turns on the light. 2 weeks into the new contract rotation, the regional manager who had hired us emailed, asking for an unannounced audit across all 8 sites. "I want to see if your standards hold when no one is looking," he wrote. The old company had failed 3 surprise audits in a row. We would not. I walked those buildings like a surgeon entering an operating theater, gloved in expectation, armed with checklists. Every hinge, every baseboard, every trash liner edge, I corrected 3 tiny misses before the inspector could find them. A fingerprint on a microwave button, a crooked rug runner, a missed cobweb above a vent. Adjust, align, erase. Preparation is revenge's oxygen. The audit passed with remarks that read like music. Consistent. Thorough. No deficiencies. The manager sent a 1-line follow-up. "This is what I expected when I replaced them." Replaced. Past tense. It landed like a hinge snapping into place. 2 days later, I learned who we replaced. The previous vendor was owned by a man named Darren Holtz, Nolan's cousin. The same Nolan who laughed in the cafe, who threw a quarter at my ambition like it was a busker's hat. So when Darren lost those contracts, Nolan lost his side income, his weekend spending, his favorite brag. He had been part of the reason they kept the work. Nepotism passes envelopes without shame. I didn't engineer their fall, but I built myself in the exact space where their collapse would matter. The same afternoon I learned that, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. When I answered, it was Nolan. His tone was smaller now, as if someone had turned his volume down 5 clicks. "Hey, heard you picked up Holtz's buildings," he said. Not congratulations, not apology, just shock disguised as conversation. "We didn't pick them up," I answered. "We earned them." He exhaled like someone trying not to choke on pride. "Must be nice." "It will be," I said. once the next phase lands. I didn't elaborate. Let his imagination sweat. He hesitated. Listen, I might need work. If you're hiring... The strike happens here, not with screaming, not with revenge porn, but with memory held like glass. He mocked what he now wants proximity to. I kept my voice clean. We are hiring, I said. Pause. But not you. He waited for the explanation. I gave none. Silence is a blade when you stop cushioning it. He tried again, smaller this time. I could supervise. I've run teams. You don't qualify, I said, not cruel but final. We only hire people who know the value of what we do. He inhaled sharply. Shame sounds like someone stepping on broken glass. So that's it? That was it, I said and ended the call. Not rage. Not theatrics. Just closure delivered in present tense. But the strike wasn't over. Revenge isn't complete when one throat goes quiet. It finishes when the narrative flips permanently. The following week, the regional manager requested a deep clean demo in a 9th building. I set the crew, led the walkthrough, delivered perfection. He extended another contract, 3 more floors. After hours, then came the email that welded the strike into permanence. For security reasons, Holt's personnel have been removed from all access lists effective immediately. Removed. Access revoked. Doors closed. Keycards dead. Meanwhile, I signed 3 new hires and issued polos 1 size smaller than the weight of doubt I used to carry. While their company unraveled, mine multiplied. The city began to shift around my name in visible ways. Clients now introduced me as the owner, not the girl. Vendors returned my calls in the first ring. New proposals were met without the patronizing tone people reserve for women who start small. And then, inevitability staged itself with precision. Only fate could choreograph. Walked into the lobby of one of the new buildings for a site check and found Nolan behind the reception desk. Not as staff, but as contracted temporary labor, badge on a lanyard, wiping counters with the same brand of disinfectant I buy by the case. He didn't see me at first. He scrubbed with the unfocused haste of someone working to silence humiliation. When he finally looked up and recognized me, his spine sagged. "Don't," he muttered before I could speak. "Just don't." But I did speak, not to wound, but to document the symmetry aloud. "You once laughed at the idea of me owning a company," I said. "Now you clean in buildings that pay mine." He swallowed without lifting his eyes. "Everything turns," he murmured. "Not by accident," I replied. The strike was not watching him labor. It was realizing his laughter had expired. It had no jurisdiction in the present. The economy of humiliation had inverted. I left him there, cloth in hand, beneath lights I now billed hourly. I didn't send a photograph. I didn't post a victory statement. Revenge that requires an audience is theater, not justice. Driving to the next site, I felt no fireworks, only a profound stillness. Power rarely feels like fire. It feels like the end of trembling. That night, I opened the safe and added the new contract copy beside the first. Paper on paper, proof layered like sediment. I didn't label them. History doesn't need captions when the contrast is this clean. Before bed, I checked voicemail. "My mother again. I saw your name on a flyer downtown," she said, voice smaller than I remembered. Maybe I was wrong to worry. Maybe you saw farther than I could. Not an apology, but the fracture before one. I didn't call back. Some replies are better delivered with time. The strike was complete, not because he fell, but because I had risen outside the reach of his opinion. Revenge isn't when the mocker kneels. Revenge is when their worldview stops applying to you. I turned off the lights and slept a full night without waking once. Reckonings don't always arrive in courtrooms or on stages. Sometimes they arrive in whispers spreading through buildings you now own by contract. In conversations you are not present for, but are now shaped by your name. Public reckoning is quieter than people imagine. Not a spectacle, but a shift in gravity. It began with an email chain I was not meant to see. A manager at one of our buildings forwarded the wrong thread when sending a supply request. Scrolling down, I found a note from one of the executives dated the week before we took over. "Replace Holtz immediately. Floors dull, staff unreliable, complaints piling. Testing new firm? Hope they aren't another gamble." Below that, 1 month later, a new reply. Night and day difference. Heart is thorough. Renew. 2 unadorned lines. 2 sentences long enough to bury a whole company's reputation. And I was the shovel without knowing it. Word of our performance traveled sideways. Property teams talked to other property teams the way bartenders talk to each other after closing. Blunt, useful, never formal. Suddenly, I was getting copy-pasted praise from people I had never met, citing work I had never personally touched. That is when you know your standards have multiplied, when your hands are no longer required for your name to be carried. Then came the Panel A Business Association sent an invitation for a roundtable on operational integrity and vendor transitions. I almost deleted it. Panels are where people masquerade as experts, but then I saw the roster. 1 other confirmed speaker, Darren Holtz. I read the name twice. No rage stirred. Only clarity. Public Reckoning had walked to my door and knocked politely. The event took place in a hotel ballroom with beige carpet and fake ficus trees. I wore black, not to look powerful, but to look finished. Darren arrived late, face drawn with the tiredness of someone still pretending. When the moderator introduced us, he smiled at me with the brittle courtesy of men who forget history when convenient. The first question went to him. What's the greatest risk when outsourcing facilities management? He spoke with rehearsed authority. Lack of consistency. Once standards slip, trust is hard to rebuild. I watched him articulate his own obituary without blinking. Then the moderator turned to me. And you? Your firm replaced multiple vendors recently. What distinguishes a reliable team from an unreliable one? I didn't mention Darren's company. I didn't need to. I spoke instead in clean blades. Unreliable firms make promises. Reliable firms make systems. Promises require faith. Systems require proof. The room hummed with the sound of people writing that down. Later, during Q&A, an audience member asked about poaching contracts. Isn't it cutthroat to take a competitor's client? I answered without softness. No client belongs to a vendor. Customers are rented by competence. When competence leaves, so do contracts. Eyes flicked sideways toward Darren. His jaw tightened. That was the reckoning. Not humiliation delivered. Humiliation revealed. After the event, 2 managers approached me privately for quotes. None approached him. Reckoning is not when you win applause. It's when the room quietly stops asking the other person anything. Meanwhile, the city finished rewriting my reputation without consulting me. One afternoon, I visited a new site to assess scope. A junior employee held the door, glanced at my badge, and said, "Your heart? The boss said you guys don't miss corners." Not my first name, my last name. Respect without attachment. People began introducing me differently. Not, "This is Marceline, she cleans our offices," but, "This is Hart, she runs our buildings." Language exposes hierarchy long before signage does. Even my mother felt the tremor in the air. She called one evening, voice softer than its usual steel. "I saw your company van outside the bank," she said. People were talking about how clean it stays now. She inhaled like she was swallowing pride. They were impressed. I waited for the word, but it didn't come. Instead, she said slowly, "Maybe I didn't know how big this could become." For her, that sentence was a confession on its knees. I didn't rescue her from it. Letting someone face their wrongness is not cruelty. It is closure without applause. Then, the final turn of the screw happened by accident. I walked into one of our buildings early to check supplies. In the lobby, a group of employees were joking loudly about cost cuts. One of them, a tall man in a cheap tie, said, "Ever since Holtz got booted and these Hart people came, the execs won't shut up about standards." He mimicked air quotes with irritation. They even made that Holtz nephew guy come back as temp janitorial somewhere. A woman laughed. "That's what happens when you coast. Someone hungrier takes the chair," he added, scoffing. Still hilarious that Hart is just some girl who used to clean here herself. Before I could speak, another voice cut in sharply. Not some girl, the owner. It was Ms. Patel, in the building by coincidence. She pointed at me where I stood in the doorway. "That's her. Silence detonated. The tall man's face drained. I didn't mean— You meant exactly what you said, Ms. Patel replied. Then, turning to me with calm deference. Morning, Ms. Hart. Supply room is stocked as you requested, Ms. Hart. The title sat in the air like a verdict stamped in wax. I nodded once and walked past them without breaking stride. No lecture. No retaliation, no need. Reckoning had already done its work. Not in my voice, in theirs. That night I sat in my car before driving home and let the day replay. Not the mockery, but the correction. The world was editing itself around me. I had passed the invisible line between convincing and being recognized. Public reckoning is not when they apologize. It is when they adjust. Not when they admit you were right, but when they begin behaving as if you always were. And in that quiet, without champagne or witnesses, I understood. The strike wounded pride. The reckoning rewrote reality. I turned the key in the ignition and drove into a future that no longer needed proof. After a storm, the world doesn't go silent. It rearranges itself. The buildings don't move, but the shadows fall in new places. That is what the aftermath felt like. Not an ending, but a new alignment. Work no longer felt like scrambling up a cliff. It felt like steering something already in motion. The schedule still demanded early alarms and late nights, but the panic had drained from the hours. I no longer checked my bank account with dread. I checked it with strategy. I no longer waited to see if I would survive. I calculated how far I could expand, but the aftermath was not all triumph. Victory has its ghosts. Some mornings I would wake with the old anxiety out of habit, the body bracing for a blow that no longer existed. I would stand in the bathroom staring into the mirror, waiting for the doubt to arrive the way pain sometimes echoes after a healed wound. And when it didn't, I didn't feel relief first. I felt confusion. When you have lived inside struggle long enough, peace can feel like someone forgot to lock the door. Joy noticed it before I did. Your face is different, she said one night in the break room between shifts. Less braced, I laughed softly. I don't know if I remember how to live without bracing. She shrugged. You'll relearn. And I believed her. Meanwhile, my mother's voice changed like wood softening after rain. She called not to discourage, but to report sightings of my work in the world. I heard a woman at my salon say Hart people don't cut corners, she said one Monday instead of her usual warnings. She didn't know I was your mother. It was meant to be pride, but I heard the grief in it too. Grief for all the years she bet against what eventually arrived. I didn't punish her for it. Age teaches you that some people wound not from malice, but from fear too old to unwind. I began answering her calls again, not to seek approval, but to show that I no longer required it. Even Nolan drifted to the edges of my mind like an outgrown jacket still hanging in the closet out of inertia. When his cousin's company dissolved officially, word spread fast. I expected to feel something sharp. But all I felt was distance. Revenge had finished its job so cleanly that he no longer occupied the psychological, square footage he once rented without paying. The real aftermath happened not in those public collapses, but in private recalibration. One evening, sitting in my car outside a building we serviced, I realized I no longer rehearsed imaginary arguments, the ones where I proved myself to people who had never deserved the explanation. That silence inside me was the loudest metric of all. When the argument dies, the wound has already scarred over, and the scars are not ugly. They are architectural. They hold me upright. I began noticing little shifts. I now introduced myself without softening the word, owner. I stopped shrinking my achievements and sentences to make them digestible for others. I no longer lowered my voice when speaking about money. I did not apologize for increasing rates. I corrected disrespect with a single look instead of an essay. Resilience does not shout. It occupies space without asking. The employees changed too. They stopped calling me boss like a nickname and began saying it like a title earned. Luis once said, while loading the buffer into the van, "You built a place where workers aren't invisible." I didn't answer. Some praise lands heavier when it sits in the air uncollected. Growth required new decisions, hiring supervisors, leasing a real office, restructuring routes. I made those choices without flinching. Failure teaches you a language fluency you cannot get any other way. Once you've survived scarcity, logistics do not scare you. The biggest change was the quiet in my head. The inner war had gone dormant. I was no longer arguing with a chorus of past voices. I was speaking into a room I owned. That is a kind of revenge no headline can contain. Yet the aftermath also carried a sober clarity. I won not because they underestimated me, but because I stopped underestimating myself. Doubt didn't lose. I outgrew the version of me it belonged to. One evening after payroll, I walked through one of our buildings alone. The hallways glowed softly. The night crew had already finished. The air smelled faintly of lemon and static. I stood in the center of the empty lobby and tried to locate the girl who once scrubbed these same tiles, praying to break even. She wasn't there anymore. In her place stood a woman who had buried her without funeral, not from cruelty, but from evolution. I sat on a bench in the lobby and closed my eyes. I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt something deeper, completion. Not the kind that ends a book, but the kind that ends a chapter with spine. When I opened my eyes, I whispered, not to God, not to ghosts, but to the quiet itself. I made it out. The words did not tremble. They landed, and perhaps that is the real face of revenge. Not their ruin, not your crown, but the moment you can say I made it out without needing anyone to hear it. Because by then, the world already knows. People assume the ending of a revenge story is loud. A public downfall, an apology screamed through tears, a dramatic collapse under the weight of regret. But real endings are quieter. They arrive like a door clicking shut in a hallway you no longer walk down. In the months that followed, my life didn't explode into luxury or legend. It stabilized, and stability, when you have lived hunched under doubt, feels like luxury in its purest form. My mornings began with coffee and silence, not panic. My phone rang with contracts, not collections. Payroll days no longer frightened me. I drove to buildings I used to enter through side doors, and I walked in now with a badge that opened the front. That shift, from tolerated to trusted, from questioned to quoted, remapped my spine. I found myself wearing makeup again sometimes, not because I needed to present myself for approval, but because I finally had the energy to decorate the life I wasn't fighting to survive. I bought produce without counting bills. I slept without bargaining with tomorrow. I learned how to breathe slowly, like someone who expects another breath. The world also adjusted its tone. The same people who once offered me backup plans now asked how I scaled. The ones who called my work temporary now used my company name as a benchmark. Even the buildings seemed to hold me differently. Doors opened faster, greetings warmer, credit given without hesitation. My mother, too, softened. Not theatrically, but in increments. Her Monday calls changed from warnings to questions of curiosity. How many employees now? Another contract? Will you hire office staff soon? She didn't say the sentence I once craved. I was wrong about you. But she said others that proved she knew it. One afternoon, she even asked timidly, "Do you need anything from me?" I nearly laughed from the unfamiliarity of the offer. I told her the truth. I needed you to stop betting against me, and she did. Silence can be an apology when the right voice finally withholds itself. As for Nolan, he became irrelevant long before he became invisible. I passed him once, mopping the marble of a lobby our company serviced. He didn't look up. I didn't slow down. Revenge was not in seeing him work beneath my contract. It was in the fact that I no longer cared enough to feel anything about it. I didn't need him to know he lost. His life already told him. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the tightening of systems, the hiring of staff, the forming of a company that didn't limp, something unexpected replaced the hunger for revenge, dignity. A kind you can't lose even if the world flips again. I found myself teaching younger cleaners the same truth. I once whispered to myself, that work done with pride rewrites the story written about you long before words can catch up. That nothing is small when it becomes the reason someone eats. That the world underestimates the hands that build what others stand on. One night, after closing a new contract meeting. I drove to the waterfront and sat alone watching the reflections of buildings ripple against the dark water. Those same buildings had once looked impossible. Now they were invoices with due dates. I thought about all the years I begged for someone to believe in me, how I waited for approval the way some wait for weather to change, and how useless that wait had been. No one is required to see your future. They only live long enough to witness it. That is the part movies never show. Not the revenge, but the stillness after revenge, when your life is no longer a reaction but a direction. Sitting there, with the wind slipping off the river and my name printed on papers locked in a safe, I understood with absolute certainty. I never needed to defeat them. I only needed to outlast the version of myself who once thought they were judges. I built the thing they swore I couldn't, not to humiliate them, but to liberate me. And that is the closure, not their regret, my release. And if my story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they too deserve respect and unconditional love. Because sometimes the loudest revenge is not proving them wrong. It is living a life where their opinion no longer registers as truth. Tell me, if no one ever doubted you again, what would you build without hesitation?